This banned Wild West photo tells a story history books refused to publish. Dr. Emily Thornton stared at the faded photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. What had begun as routine research into Colorado's prison system had led her to this image, tucked away in a forgotten archive box at the Denver Historical Society. The sepia-toned photograph from 1883 showed a stern-faced lawman Sheriff James Miller of Summit County, according to the faded inscription standing proudly beside a prisoner in front of the newly constructed territorial prison. There was nothing unusual about such an image. Sheriffs often documented their captures, but something about the prisoner's expression caught Emily's attention. Not defeated or angry, but oddly resolute. What made this worth preserving? She muttered, lifting the magnifying glass. That's when she noticed it, a folded paper protruding from the prisoner's jacket pocket with visible handwriting. Curious, she enhanced the image using the archive's digital scanner. "I need to see any records you have on this prisoner," Emily told the archivist, pointing to the man in the photo. The archivist returned with a thin folder. "Not much here. Name's Michael Hayes, charged with trespassing and interference with business operations. Sentenced to 6 months, but died of fever after just 2 weeks in custody." Emily frowned. "That's convenient. There's something else," the archivist added. "This photo was initially cataloged, then removed from public records by order of the territorial governor. It was only rediscovered during renovations in 1976. Emily's historian instincts tingled. Photos weren't banned without reason, especially not by governors. Whatever Michael Hayes knew, or whatever that paper in his pocket contained, someone powerful had wanted it buried forever. Back in her university office, Emily researched everything she could find about Michael Hayes. The pieces came together slowly. Scattered mentions in newspaper archives revealed he wasn't a common criminal, but a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, sent west to cover the silver boom. He was writing exposes, Emily told her research assistant Robert, spreading out photocopies of archived articles. "Listen to this from March 1883. This correspondent has uncovered troubling patterns in recent claim. Disputes that suggest coordination between certain officials and railroad interests." The article stopped abruptly in April 1883, the same month as the photograph. Emily dug deeper, finding Hayes had previously covered labor disputes in Pennsylvania and corporate fraud in New York. His editor at the Tribune had published a brief obituary noting his unfortunate passing while pursuing a story of significant public interest. "I need to see what was on that paper in his pocket," Emily said, studying the enhanced photograph. The visible portion showed what looked like a list of names and numbers. A letter to the Chicago Tribune's archives brought an unexpected response. They had no files from Hayes after March 1883, but they did have a personal effect, a small notebook recovered from Colorado, never claimed by family. Why would a journalist be arrested for trespassing? Robert wondered. "Because he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be," Emily replied. "Seeing something somebody wanted to keep hidden." The notebook arrived by courier the following week. Inside its weathered cover, Emily found the answer, a hand-drawn map of mining claims around Silver Cliff with notations in a careful cipher. The hunt was just beginning. The cipher in Hayes' notebook took Emily 2 weeks to crack. When she finally did, it revealed a meticulous documentation of claim jumping. Incident's original miners, driven off their claims through intimidation or legal manipulation, all subsequently acquired by Westland Mining Company. "Westland Mining?" Emily murmured, the name vaguely familiar. Her research led to Augustus Thornton, no relation, one of Colorado's wealthiest silver barons and a former state senator. In the territorial archives, Emily discovered connections between Thornton, the sheriff from the photograph, and Judge Walter Keating, who had sentenced Hayes. More disturbingly, she found records of 37 separate land disputes involving small claim holders versus Westland. Judge Keating had ruled in Westland's favor in all 37 cases. "This isn't coincidence," Emily told Robert as they cataloged the pattern. Hayes was documenting a systematic theft of mining claims. The breakthrough came when they found a surveyor's log mentioning unusual reassessments ordered for the same claims Hayes had documented. "The fix was in," Robert said. change the survey boundaries, claim the miners were trespassing on Westland property, and have them arrested when they protested. Emily nodded grimly. And when a journalist started connecting the dots, they both stared at the photograph of Hayes standing beside the sheriff. The condemned man hiding evidence in plain sight, evidence that would never reach his newspaper. But why keep the photograph at all? Robert wondered. Trophies, Emily replied. Powerful men document their victories. They just never expected anyone to look closely at their moment of triumph. Emily traveled to Silver Cliff, now a quiet town that had never recaptured its boomtown glory. The local historical society occupied a former assayer's office, its walls adorned with sepia photographs of bearded miners and wooden storefronts. I'm researching Michael Hayes, Emily told the elderly volunteer, producing a copy of the photograph. He was here in 1883. The woman studied it with narrowed eyes. That's Sheriff Miller, all right. Mean as a rattlesnake, my grandfather said. Emily spent hours combing through the society's disorganized archives, finally finding tax records listing the original claim holders Hayes had documented. Most had simply vanished from subsequent records. At the county clerk's office, death certificates revealed the fate of 3 miners who had filed formal complaints. 1, accident in a shaft collapse. 1, suicide. 1, killed in saloon altercation. They weren't just stealing claims, Emily realized. They were eliminating anyone who fought back. That evening in her hotel room, Emily received an email from Robert with newspaper scans from April 1883. A small article reported a fire at a boarding house that killed 4 men, described as itinerant miners. The names weren't familiar until Emily cross-referenced Hayes' notebook. These were his sources, she gasped. All died within days of his arrest. The next morning, she visited the town cemetery, finding unmarked graves in the Potter's Field section from the same period. As she photographed the area, an elderly man approached, leaning heavily on a cane. You're asking about Michael Hayes, he said, not a question. My father knew him, said he was the only man brave enough to stand against Thornton. Dad was just a boy then, working in the company store. He always said there was more to that story than most folks knew. Emily traced Sheriff Miller's history, discovering he'd arrived in Colorado not as a lawman, but as a hired gun for the railroads, breaking up worker strikes before being appointed sheriff with Thornton's backing. His appointment letter is signed by the territorial governor, Robert noted in their video call, who later became vice president of Westland Mining after leaving office. Emily had gained access to Miller's personal papers through his great-granddaughter, a retired schoolteacher who had inherited trunks of family documents but never examined them closely. My family never talked much about him, the woman admitted. There was some shame there, I think, among ledgers and correspondence. Emily found a small notebook tracking payment sums that far exceeded a sheriff's salary, labeled only with initials. More damning was a letter from Thornton that read, "Handle the Tribune man quietly. No unnecessary roughness, but ensure he understands the consequences of further inquiry." He was on Thornton's payroll, Emily told Robert. The question is whether he was just intimidating Hayes or something worse. The answer came in the prison records. Sheriff Miller had personally delivered Hayes to the territorial prison and, more significantly, was present during the medical emergency that led to Hayes' death. Most revealing was a receipt for a telegram Miller sent to Thornton the day of Hayes' death. Matter resolved permanently. All materials secured, but they hadn't secured everything. The photograph itself was evidence they'd missed, and Hayes' notebook had somehow made its way back to Chicago. Someone helped him, Emily realized. Someone within the system who made sure at least some evidence survived. That night, Emily carefully examined the photograph again. In the background stood a prison guard, barely visible in the shadows. When enhanced, his face showed an expression not of pride, but of barely concealed disgust. The guard's name was Thomas Sullivan, according to prison staff records. Further research revealed he'd resigned his position shortly after Hayes' death and relocated to Wyoming. Emily traveled to Cheyenne, where she discovered Sullivan had lived a long life, working as a station master until his death in 1932. His obituary mentioned his widow, Harriet, who had outlived him by nearly 20 years. Through genealogical records, Emily traced their granddaughter, Catherine, now living in a retirement community in Fort Collins. My grandfather never spoke much about his time as a prison guard, Catherine told Emily, serving tea in her small apartment. But grandmother said it troubled him. He kept a journal, though. Would that help your research? The leather journal, brittle with age, contained Sullivan's meticulous accounts. The entry for April 18, 1883, was chilling. Hayes brought in today. Not a criminal, but clearly a man marked for silencing. Sheriff. Spoke privately with Jennings about ensuring he doesn't serve his full sentence. God help me for being part of this system. Subsequent entries detailed Sullivan's growing concern as Hayes was placed in the dampest cell block and denied proper food. Then came the critical entry. Hayes passed me his notebook during exercise period. Says if anything happens to him, I'm to send it to his editor in Chicago. The man knows he's been marked. 3 days later, they're saying fever took Hayes. A convenient fever that left bruises on his throat. I've tendered my resignation. We'll post the package to Chicago from Laramie where Miller's reach doesn't extend. Emily sat back, stunned. He knew they murdered Hayes, and he made sure the evidence wasn't completely destroyed. What Sullivan couldn't save was the most damning document, whatever paper had been visible in Hayes' pocket in the photograph. But his active conscience had preserved part of the truth for future discovery. Emily focused her investigation on the document in Hayes' pocket. Enhancing the photograph further, she could make out what appeared to be a letterhead. It's from the Territorial Land Office, she told Robert. I can just make out the seal. At the State Archives, Emily requested all correspondence between the Land Office and Westland Mining from 1882 to 1883. The archival boxes contained mundane approvals and surveys, but also a stunning discovery, a confidential survey map showing silver deposits on lands not yet claimed by Westland. This explains everything, Emily said. Hayes obtained proof that Thornton knew exactly which claims to target because he had inside information from government. Surveys that weren't public. Further digging revealed Thornton had paid for expedited surveys of these areas, a legal-sounding cover for what amounted to bribery of survey officials. It gets worse, Robert said during their daily call. I found records showing Westland sold these consolidated claims to Eastern investors at 5 times their purchase price, claiming they were proven productive. Emily nodded. And Hayes had evidence of the whole scheme, the fraudulent surveys, the targeted harassment, the corrupted legal proceedings. She arranged the documents chronologically, reconstructing Hayes' investigation. His final notes suggested he had obtained a copy of a letter from Thornton to the Land Office requesting specific surveys and promising appropriate compensation for discretion. That must have been the document in his pocket, Emily concluded. The smoking gun that connected a state senator directly to corruption. The photograph had captured not just a prisoner and his captor, but the evidence of conspiracy that powerful men thought would die with Hayes. Instead, through a quirk of photographic preservation, it had endured to tell its story decades later. Emily traveled to mining towns throughout the region, searching for descendants of the original claim holders. Most families had scattered after losing their livelihood, but in Pueblo, she found Daniela Ortiz, great-granddaughter of Manuel Ortiz, one of the displaced miners. My great-grandfather always insisted he was cheated, Daniela said, showing Emily faded family photographs. He had a legal claim to that silver, but suddenly, men with guns said he was trespassing on Westland property. Daniela produced a cherished family possession, a small silver pocket watch. He managed to extract enough ore before they drove him off to have this made. He called it his proof that the silver was rightfully his. Similar stories emerged in other families' legal claims. Suddenly invalidated, threats and violence driving miners away, sheriffs and judges consistently siding with Westland. My great-grandfather tried fighting in court, James Weber told Emily in Colorado Springs. Judge Keating threw out his case in 5 minutes and had him arrested for wasting the court's time. He lost everything. Through these personal accounts, Emily reconstructed the human cost of the conspiracy. Hayes had uncovered dozens of families robbed of their legitimate claims and livelihoods, some losing members to suspicious accidents or confrontations. Most poignant was her interview with Benjamin Kelly, whose grandfather had been Hayes' printer in Silver Cliff, secretly setting type for leaflets Hayes had distributed about the claim disputes. After Hayes was arrested, they smashed our press and threatened to burn our home if Grandpa didn't leave town, Kelly explained. He always wondered what happened to Hayes' evidence. Syed Hayes promised it would bring down giants once it reached Chicago. These forgotten stories gave human dimension to the conspiracy, not just financial fraud, but the deliberate destruction of lives and communities to enrich the already powerful. Back at her university, Emily compiled her findings into a comprehensive report. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling a pattern of corruption, intimidation, and likely murder orchestrated by some of Colorado's most celebrated historical figures. Senator Augustus Thornton has 3 buildings named after him on college campuses, Emily noted bitterly. His official biography calls him a visionary who developed Colorado's mineral wealth. The final piece came from an unexpected source. A history professor in Chicago had discovered an unpublished editorial in the Tribune archives, written after Hayes' death, but never printed. It is with profound regret that we acknowledge our failure to protect our correspondent. Michael Hayes, whose recent death in Colorado raises disturbing questions we cannot safely investigate further. Hayes' final communications suggested corruption at levels that render justice impossible at present. Perhaps future generations will uncover what powerful interests have buried today. Emily published her findings in the Journal of Western History under the title The Silenced Story: Journalism, Corruption, and Murder in Colorado's Silver Rush. Her article included the enhanced photograph, the decoded evidence from Hayes' notebook, and the testimony of descendants. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some historians dismissed her conclusions as speculative. Others praised her rigorous research. Most significantly, 3 major universities announced reviews of their Thornton memorials in light of new historical evidence. "You've rewritten history," Robert told her as they watched the debate unfold. "Or rather, you've uncovered the history that was suppressed." Emily shook her head. "Hayes tried to write it first. I just finished what he started." 1 year later, Emily stood in the Colorado History Museum, watching as visitors examined a new exhibit. Justice Delayed: The Michael Hayes Story. At its center was the photograph that had started her investigation, now accompanied by Hayes' notebook, Sullivan's journal, and the evidence she had painstakingly assembled. Most powerful was the wall displaying photographs of the miners and their families who had been victimized by the conspiracy faces and names now restored to the historical record after generations of erasure. A plaque beside the photograph read, "Sometimes history's most important stories are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closer." The Thornton Foundation had fought the exhibit, but public opinion had turned decisively as Emily's research was validated by other historians. The state legislature had even passed a resolution acknowledging the historical injustice and formally recognizing Hayes' contribution to journalism. "What drew you to this particular photograph?" asked a museum visitor, a young journalism student working on a paper. Emily considered the question carefully. Something in Hayes' eyes. He knew he was documenting more than his own arrest. He was creating evidence. Even as they thought they were silencing him, he was ensuring the truth would eventually be seen. She gestured to the photograph, to the paper visible in Hayes' pocket. The powerful men who thought they'd buried this story didn't understand that sometimes truth finds a way to survive. Hayes couldn't speak to us directly, but he left breadcrumbs for someone to follow. As the student jotted notes, Emily gazed at the photograph that had started her journey. A supposedly simple image of law and order, a sheriff and his prisoner, had revealed itself as something far more complex. A document of corruption, courage, and the long path to justice. Some stories take generations to tell. This one had waited in a forgotten archive, preserved in silver nitrate and paper, until someone finally looked closely enough to see what history books had refused to publish.